Welcome back to Tax UK, the practical tax channel with myself, Adam Hill. Today we're going to be looking at how you can avoid HMRC investigations when submitting your self-assessment tax return. Now, unfortunately for lots of people out there, the stress that comes with completing and submitting a self-assessment tax return doesn't always disappear at the point that the return gets submitted, and that's because the threat of triggering an investigation from HMRC lingers for some time afterwards. Typically, an investigation would be triggered within 12 months of the 31st of January deadline that follows the tax year in question. This means that for the 2021 tax year, which had a submission deadline of the end of January 2022, most investigations would be triggered by the 31st of January 2023. However, I would point out that you are required to maintain supporting documentation and financial records like bank statements and receipts covering expenses for 5 years following that 31st of January deadline. So technically, an investigation could be triggered anytime within that period, although it becomes less likely after 12 months have passed. As always on Tax UK, it's the practical side of tax that we're interested in. So unlike other channels who might recommend that you are always honest and double check your numbers, I'm actually going to log into my tax account and share my self-assessment with you, and I'm going to show you 2 entries which will almost certainly trigger an automatic investigation, and then I'm also going to show you 2 common mistakes that people tend to make, which again will dramatically increase your chances of a HMRC tax investigation. Before we get going, if you do find this type of content useful, please make sure you like the video and of course subscribe to the channel. You can also check out my other channel, Trader UK, where we cover lots of investing related content, and you'll find a link for that one down in the description. Here we are in my 21-22 self-assessment tax return under the Tailor Your Return section, page 2 of 3. This is where you'll find the first entry, which will almost certainly trigger some form of investigation from HMRC. And that question is located here. Did you incorrectly claim an amount of coronavirus support payment? By saying yes to this question, you will actually generate a second question or follow-up question. Have you already made arrangements to repay that amount either by informing HMRC or being in receipt of an assessment issued by an officer of HMRC for that amount? And again, you can answer yes or no. So what they're asking you here is, did you incorrectly claim any coronavirus support payment? And then secondly, are we already aware of this? Have we already agreed to recover that amount of money? Now, it's this second question really that could trigger the investigation. If you say yes, then you're telling HMRC that you're already aware of this. They will usually check their records very quickly, which I wouldn't really consider a full investigation. If their records agree and show that you have already agreed to repay that amount, then no investigation would usually be triggered. However, if you say no to this second question, then you actually have to provide a bit more detail, which I'll show you in just 1 second. And I think it becomes increasingly likely that somebody from HMRC will be getting in contact with you regarding this. So that's our first entry on the return that is highly likely to trigger an automatic investigation. The second trigger, again under the Tailor Your Return section on page 3, is at the bottom of the page. You'll find a question here that says, have you used one or more tax avoidance schemes? Now, tax avoidance schemes are quite funny because as per the law, you actually have to inform HMRC if you are using a tax avoidance scheme, and 9 times out of 10, they actually end up recovering the money from you at a later date in court. So often they don't actually prove to be that effective. However, if you inform HMRC here that you have been part of a tax avoidance scheme, then you'll have to provide details of that scheme. They all usually have a reference number that you have to provide to HMRC, and they will request further information regarding that scheme. Depending on the information that you then provide, this again is highly likely to trigger some kind of investigation from HMRC. And just to demonstrate this in full, you can see here on the fill in your return section that where I've entered details in those two trigger points that I mentioned, two additional sections of the return have been generated. One here, which is my incorrectly claimed coronavirus support payments, and then another for the tax avoidance scheme. By clicking on each link, you can see here that HMRC will request additional details about the amount of coronavirus support payment that you incorrectly claimed, and the amount of SEISS payments incorrectly claimed, which is an additional support payment. And then under the tax avoidance scheme, the additional details that you're required to enter, as mentioned, you have more than one tax avoidance scheme, and again, you're required to provide a reference and then give details about when the advantage is actually arising. It is important to point out that investigations tend to come in different forms. So typically, when you submit a tax return, your tax return will get run through an algorithm which will review the numbers and the details that you provide. And I guess that's what most people want. They want their tax return to be reviewed by the algorithm and not necessarily by an individual. If there are entries on that return that the algorithm deemed to be suspect or require further attention, then some of those returns will get flagged for human review. And although at that point that is technically a form of investigation, it can be that that human being looks at the return, double checks the details and thinks, do you know what, actually this is okay, and then confirms it for full submission. Or at this point, if the reviewer decides that they're still not happy with the numbers or a number, then they may well get in contact with you and ask them for help confirming something. And that could be in the form of a bank statement or a P60, a pay document, or any kind of supporting information before they're actually able to close that case. And then in much rarer circumstances, you also have what I would consider a full investigation, which is where HMRC requests you for all the documentation supporting your self-assessment tax return, and they tend to go through your information with a fine-tooth comb. Now, we've been through two entry points on the return, which are very likely to trigger an investigation of some form from HMRC. Now, I want to show you two very common mistakes that people tend to make when submitting their self-assessment tax return, which again increase the likelihood of you receiving an investigation from HMRC. The first is again under the tailor your return section. In fact, it's on the first page and it's the very first question, or the first couple of questions. And this comes about because I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between being an employee, being a director, and being self-employed as well, which then gets questioned in the question below here. So just to clear this up, if you're an employee, you will receive pay slips from your employer which have a PAYE reference number. They pay you after tax has been deducted, so they calculate how much you've earned in the period, whether that's a week or a month or any period of time, and they then deduct an appropriate amount of tax. Okay, so you get paid net of tax. Now, you might have more than one employment in a period or in a tax year. That could be because you work part-time and you have 3 or 4 part-time jobs. It could be because you left one job, started a new job, left that job, started another job. You could have multiple jobs within the same tax year, and you would again have a employment for each of those. Now, each employment will provide you with a certificate of earnings. That certificate of earnings will either be a P45 or a P60. And when you're preparing your tax return, those are the two documents that you want. Okay, you want to have those with you, any P45s and P60. A P45 comes from an employer when you leave employment partway through a tax year, and a P60 comes from any employer that you hold employment with on the 5th of April at the end of the tax year. Okay, so make sure you have those to hand if you do have employment. Being a director, This usually applies to limited companies or companies, but primarily limited companies. So if you are a director of a company, you need to declare that as well. It can be quite similar to being an employee, but a director of a company is charged with managing a company or running a company. You need to inform HMRC of any directorships that you have. However, it's only directorships where you receive a salary or benefits, okay, from the company in a similar way as you would in an employment. Okay, if you are the director of a company or multiple companies, but you don't receive any salary or benefits from that company, then you don't actually need to inform HMRC. So just bear that in mind. With this first question, being an employee or a director, just remember, if you receive a salary, then HMRC are actually already aware of that. They know how much salary you receive. They know how much tax you've already paid, because your employers would have already provided them with that information when they submit their monthly RTI returns, their real-time information payroll returns. Okay, so they're already aware of this information. So you need to make sure that any information that you provide to HMRC agrees back to their records. So if you have 2 employments, you need to tell them about those 2 employments. Otherwise, again, you're going to get an investigation. You're going to get someone asking you what's going on. Why haven't you declared one of your employment? And then self-employment's below. Now, the second question asks, was your turnover more than £1,000 in total from self-employment? And that's because technically, if your total income from all self-employment, even where you have multiple, is less than £1,000, then technically you don't need to tell HMRC anything about it. Okay. Now, self-employment is different because HMRC don't know how much you earn from self-employment. They don't know how much tax you need to pay. They need you to self-declare that information to them. And again, you would do that by answering the second question here. Now, the mistake that people tend to make here is that they go ahead and declare their self-employment, and they'll tell HMRC how much money they earn from that self-employment, but they forget to declare their employment income. And I guess from their point of view, they think that employment income has already been declared to HMRC. They've already paid tax on it. Why would they then declare it on a tax return again? And that's quite logical to think. However, it's important to remember that HMRC don't know how much tax you need to pay from your self-employment yet. And the amount of tax that you pay from your self-employment is actually dependent on how much you earned and how much tax you paid from other sources of income, in particular from your employment or directorship. So they need to know all of this information in order to calculate your tax. So it's really important that if you have a side income as well as your employment, that you are declaring both. First of all, you need to declare your employment, and again, take the details from your P60 or P45. That way, you know that what you submit is going to agree to the records that HMRC have on file, because they get the other side of that or another part of that P45 or P60, so you know it's going to agree. And then declare your self-employed income as well. And then the second common mistake I see is overuse or misuse of this right here. This is known as white space, and you'll find it a few times throughout the return. So this is for my self-employed income. It allows you to provide any additional information that you see fit that may assist with somebody looking at or reviewing your return. So there are situations where you want to provide additional information, and there are situations where you just don't need to provide additional information. So it's a case of using this space correctly. Now, in situations where you have something on your return where you already know that it's going to raise eyebrows or it looks a little bit funny, then that's a great opportunity to provide additional information. Maybe you've had rental income for the last 10 years in a row, and then this year you haven't disposed of the property, but you don't have any rental income. Maybe it's a good idea to use the white space in that scenario to give 1 or 2 lines of information and explain, hey, I'm planning to sell the property, so I don't have, and I'm I'm getting it ready to be sold, so I don't have any rental income in this tax year. Or, hey, we're renovating it, so we expect rental returns to return next year. That's a good use of the white space. However, if you have a very, very basic return where you just have employment income and maybe a bit of self-employment income, and we're talking quite small numbers, there's actually often no need to provide additional information. If it doesn't add something to your return, if it doesn't explain something, then there's no need to add that information here. And in fact, like I say, by adding additional information here where it isn't required, the algorithm is going to struggle to digest this. So it's often going to flag it up to get a human to actually look at it, which increases your chances of an actual investigation. Okay, so it's very important that the white space is used correct. Now, guys, those were some of the common triggers and common mistakes that often lead to HMRC tax investigations off the back of the self-assessment tax return. I hope you found that useful. As always, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.